a country might produce LBMA good delivery bars that are, sought after and on the balance sheet of all the different banks and held in vaults throughout the world and traded amongst distributors and dealers and so forth. And then, we go to war with that country, or there's sanctions with that country, and all of a sudden those bars are kind of persona non grata in the chain, as it were. Russia is a great example of this. A lot of Russian bars floating around the marketplace, and we were friendly with Russia for a long time, especially in the wake of 9/11. We were, fairly collaborative with them on a lot of different things, and then now all of a sudden those bars are really no good. The banks don't want to trade in them, and yet they're sort of still living in the market. What is the LBMA's response to that, and kind of how to handle that process? And it just kind of makes me think, if one day you're walking along the beach in England and you're walking the dog and you run into a Russian silver bar, 1,000-ounce silver bar worth $35,000, what do you do with it?
Well, it was obviously it was a very difficult time, and at the time when the sanctions were announced, we delisted the Russian refineries. The Russian banks that were members of LBMA had their memberships revoked, as was right and proper at that time. So we took action relatively quickly to do that. The other thing we did, which is very important at that time, is any metal that existed in the market pre the date of the application of sanctions was perfectly legitimate metal. Mm-hmm. And we had to undertake a very lengthy process to identify what metal was in, what the production levels were, what was in transit, and therefore was technically sanctioned material, and so on. And we went through a massive effort to identify everything that was held, and therefore whether or not it was pre or post the sanction date. And we got to the point where we'd clarified that. We produced several sets of guidance. We've worked with a number of jurisdictions, including our own in the UK, to assist the customs teams on what to look out for and what was acceptable and what was not acceptable in accordance with the sanctions. We worked very closely to make sure that the government guidance coming out actually aligned to what was going on in the market, because our principal aim was to make sure the market could continue operating relatively seamlessly. And it took quite some time to do that. But when we acted quickly, we worked well with the UK customs. We've worked with other jurisdictions as well to assist them in understanding what they can and can't do. You can't get away from the fact, though, that there are still some issues with metal that, even though it predated sanctions and was procured perfectly legitimately and is, to all intents and purposes, good delivery, it still represents a risk to some.
And it creates that multi-tier system that you were talking about earlier.
It does create a tier system in that respect, whether we like it or not. GBI will help us in tracking bars, and it will allow us to conduct that exercise far more efficiently than we were able to do when the Russian sanctions came into place. But that said, we were still able to work very, very quickly and with all the players in the market to identify where the inventory sat and exactly what was happening. And we knew exactly what was legitimate and what was not legitimate at that time.
I want to rewind the tape about 5 months to January, February of this past year. Mm. And all of the talk internationally was of the tariffs. And there was a lot of panic in the market because, at the time, there was a lot of uncertainty as to whether or not there would be tariffs on precious metals. That was not explicitly articulated in any of the documents, at least in the early going. And very quickly, there was an escalating carry trade between England and the United States, where an inordinate amount of metal started moving from the London vaults to the New York vaults. Take me back to that time, and what was that like for you as the governing body of, most of the participants in those trades, and what was the experience like? What was on your mind? Was it stressful? What was that all like?
Well, interestingly, whilst the driving force behind it was different, we actually went through something very similar. A similar price dislocation process happened during COVID. And so there was a dislocation because people didn't think that metal could fly or move around, and therefore it would be very difficult for futures on the New York market to settle because the gold wasn't there to be able to do. So part of what we were doing back then is working out ways in which that could happen. So we worked with the CME at that point to introduce the concept that CME futures could be settled on gold held in London to reduce the amount of metal that did have to move. Now, the circumstances in January were slightly different, and we always find ourselves in a position of we look at what is going on, we need to identify what's the best way of putting it? We need to recognise and identify those items that are in the press that perhaps need some qualification. Shall we say they're not quite as they should be? And there were quite a few things in January that were not quite true. To say that London was emptying out at a rapid rate, there was a lot of metal moving, but what you need to settle in New York is different from what you need to settle in London. So you may need to move a metal out of London for reprocessing. So it has to fly from London to a refiner, wherever that might be, reprocessed into the bars that can then be settled in New York and then fly to New York from there. So it was delaying the time frame in order to settle. And our pushback in the press has got to be driven by fact, and it's got to be driven by data. So we waited until we got the vault holdings that came in from all of the London vaults. And the net impact was slightly over 1%, and the volume actually did move out of London. So there's inflows as well, but the net reduction in London stocks was about 1.2%.
That's remarkable. I was actually, in advance of this interview, I was looking, and it said here that Reuters reported that deliveries to COMEX Vault jumped 70% over 2 months, about 12.2 million troy ounces or 380 tons of gold. Mm-hmm. And it said that by the end of February 2025, London's commercial gold vault holdings fell to about 8,400 tons, 8,500 tons, a 5-year low. Silver holdings fell to 22,000 tons. So you're saying that was only 1%?
But if you look when you've got inflows as well, so at the end of the month when you've got inflows coming in as well, you ended up with quite a low change. So overall, the volume didn't change.
Okay.
What was good was that the market responded and it worked. There's probably more work that we need to do with the CME to identify how we can potentially reduce the number of times we get such dislocations happening, because obviously the market's responding to a concern that metal won't be there to settle the futures, and the willingness to roll those futures in New York is perhaps reducing because of the concerns about whether the metal is there to settle on them, and that's what drives the dislocation, or seems to drive the dislocation, and whether or not we can work out different ways to support the New York market, whether or not there's a closer way of operating between New York and London to ensure we don't have these highs and lows in that particular way. We don't need to do it. We're going to have to work on that in due course. But we do have a close relationship with the CME, so we talk about these things all the time.